First, on behalf of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, I want to thank Ambassador Pedroso for being with us. It's an honor to have you here and to be on another panel with you. I also extend thanks to all of the other participants, and especially to Allison Bodine and John Waller of the US-Cuba Normalization Committee for making this webinar possible. Let me begin with a statistic from public television ad a week ago. Quote, police have shot and killed roughly 1,000 people in the United States every year for the past 5 years, unquote. Though most of those killed are armed, according to the police, scores of them, dozens of them are not. These are the data just for the last 5 years, when they were first collected by the Washington Post. There is no evidence, even from the most vociferous enemies of the Cuban Revolution, such as the US government, that a comparable number of Cuban civilians are killed each year by their police. When some of us say, quote, there are no George Floyds in Cuba, unquote, this is the phenomenon we are pointing to. This is what we mean. These are the numbers we are referring to when we say that nothing like this exists in Cuba. The majority of those killed by the police in the United States are working people in white skin, white people or Caucasians. At the same time, working people in black and brown skin are disproportionately represented amongst the 1,000 killed each year. George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were two of them in 2020. So how does one explain such different realities, separated by only 90 miles of ocean water? The reason is that the Cubans have had since January 1959 a government that actually represents the interests of working people in all of their skin colors and other identities. What has yet to happen here? Let me explain. Before 1959, the police in Cuba were notorious. Police killings of civilians was the norm. And that only increased after 1953, the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. From 1953 until 1959, approximately 30,000 Cuban civilians out of a population of 5 million were murdered by the police. One of the things a parent feared the most was to go to the police station in search of a son and being told, after telling them his name, quote, se llamaba, unquote, meaning that's what he used to be called. No wonder that millions of Cubans took to the streets in support of the executions after 1959 of some of the most heinous of the police who were captured and tried. But how did that happen? Why was it possible to carry out revolutionary justice? To paraphrase Che Guevara, to have revolutionary justice, you have to have a revolution. The triumph of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959, was preceded by 25 months of armed struggle led by Fidel Castro to overthrow the bloody US-backed Batista regime. Whenever the rebel army liberated an area, it had to establish a government to replace the old one. Thus, along with social services like education and healthcare, a police force was established. But to be effective, it had to have, unlike the old police force, the full support and the cooperation of the local population. The policing of the area had, in other words, to involve the locals. Otherwise, it would not have worked. Thus began the remaking from the bottom up of the Cuban police. This practice informed the rebel army when it forced Batista to flee the island on 31 December 1958. In collaboration with the underground, the July 26 movement, a general strike took place the following day. Key to its success was the seizure of police stations, a relatively easy and bloodless operation, owing precisely to the mass character of the general strike. Rank and file police surrendered or tried to blend into the crowds after taking off their uniforms. Listen to what the New York Times reported on January the 6th, 1959. Quote, "No police are on the streets since they are being held in quarters, and all officers are under arrest. A few police patrol cars are circulating, occupied by 2 policemen and 2 members of the rebel militia. Boy Scouts are directing traffic in some places," unquote. Thus began the simultaneous top-down, bottom-up reinvention of Cuba's police. The rebel army commander who headed up the police in the liberated areas became the national head of Cuba's new police force. The intimate collaboration between the rebel army and the local population to police an area generalized to the entire country. The Cuban masses began, as I sometimes like to say, the Cuban masses began installing a new operating system, not just a new app, beginning on New Year's Day, 1959. Many argue that what happened to George Floyd can be traced to America's original sin, chattel slavery. That argument sounds convincing. For example, in Brazil, where the police kill civilians with impunity on a daily basis, especially Brazilians with visible roots in Africa, Brazil also had centuries of chattel slavery. And what the police do in Brazil is at least 10 times worse than what the police do in the United States, reminiscent of Batista's Cuba. But the original sin argument is inadequate. Cuba also had chattel slavery, in fact, longer than the United States. In theory, then, the George Floyd phenomenon ought to exist in Cuba, as it does in Brazil. But it doesn't. It doesn't because the Cubans made a revolution that put an end to the George Floyd phenomenon. In the 3 cases in the Americas where chattel slavery was long in place, in only one of them is the George Floyd phenomenon absent. What a difference a revolution makes. Is there a better explanation? I am not ignoring the impact of chattel slavery in Cuba's history. My point is that history isn't destiny. Cuba teaches again that we're not prisoners. We're not prisoners of history. A recent article in the Cuban newspaper Juventud Rebelde, written in recognition of International Anti-Racial Discrimination Day, March 21st. By the way, how many of us in the United States know that date? An article in Juventud Rebelde addressed honestly the continuing challenges for eliminating racist ideas and practices in Cuba. That there is greater consciousness in Cuba today about the problems bodes well for a solution. But one thing is certain: when a Cuban of African descent with visible roots in Africa encounters the police, that encounter is not as life-threatening as it is here in the United States. I know that personally.
Excuse me, August, 2 minutes,
Thank
please.
you. I know that personally from my visits to Cuba since 1983. A Black Cuban has a better chance of staying alive after such an encounter than his or her counterpart in the United States. The data, the numbers make that clear. In fact, nowhere in the Americas is someone of African origin less likely to die at the hands of the police than in Cuba. Nowhere else. And the reason? Exactly because Cuba is the only country in the Americas where the working class is in power. Again, what a revolution makes possible. Let me end by noting another example of what a difference a working class revolution makes. I'm referring to how the Cuban government has responded to the pandemic in telling contrast to the US government. A Cuban with roots in Africa has a better chance of surviving COVID-19 than their counterpart in the United States. It's an example we can discuss during the question and answer. Thank you.